Hello! Thank you for viewing this recorded version of the presentation given at the July 8th public meeting for the Port Angeles Rayonier Mill Cleanup Project. My name is Abby Zabrotsky, and I serve as a Public Involvement Coordinator with the Toxics Cleanup Program Southwest Region. This presentation will go over the Port Angeles Rayonier Mill site and study areas. We've reached a major milestone in the cleanup with a public comment period open for the review of a consent decree, draft interim action plan, and SEPA determination of non-significance. We hope that this presentation will help you learn more about the cleanup and give you details on how you can submit your comments to us. Please note, the comment period closes midnight on August 12th, 2025. Please be sure to submit your comments before then. I'll explain how you can submit your comments in detail shortly. On the screen is Ecology's project team for this cleanup. Marian Abbett is the technical lead for this project. She serves as the section manager for the Toxics Cleanup Program in Ecology's Southwest Regional Office. She is also Ecology's site manager for this cleanup project. We are accepting feedback on 3 documents. One is a consent decree. This is a legal agreement that ensures the cleanup happens according to Ecology's plan. The second is the draft interim action plan. This outlines Ecology's approach for cleaning up the study area of this site and is included as part of the legal agreement. The third is the SEPA determination of non-significance and checklist. This explains our finding that the project will not cause significant harm to the environment. You can review these documents either in person or online. If you would like to review them in person, please visit the Port Angeles Main Library or Ecology's Lacey office by appointment. You can also review documents online by visiting Ecology's Port Angeles Rayonier Mill site webpage. To do so, please visit go.ecology.wa.gov/2270. There are 3 ways you can submit your comments. You can do so online, by mail, or by email. The deadline to submit comments is Tuesday, August 12th at 11:59 p.m. Please be sure to send us your feedback on the documents or this cleanup project before then. After the public comment period ends, we will be reviewing the feedback we received and update the documents if needed. We will then put together a summary of our responses. This document, called a responsiveness summary, will be available on Ecology's Port Angeles Rayonier Mill web pages, emailed to subscribers of the Cleanup in Port Angeles email notification list, and emailed to those who submitted a comment and left their contact information. Thank you for your attention during the public involvement section of our presentation. I will now be handing things over to Marian Abbett to discuss the cleanup and proposed documents.
I'm Marian Abbett, Section Manager for the Southwest Regional Office of the Toxics Cleanup Program, and I am the Project Manager for the Port Angeles Rayonier Mill site. For this presentation, I want to provide a brief overview of the cleanup process under the State Cleanup Authority, the Model Toxics Control Act, or MACA. Then we will launch into the Rayonier Mill study area cleanup. I will provide information on the draft interim action plan, how cleanup and structure removal and restoration tie together, provide information on the consent decree, and lastly, next steps. Before I go over the state cleanup process, I wanted to point out that we are working on a number of cleanup projects in Port Angeles as shown here in the figure. If you have questions on any of these projects, please visit Ecology's website at the link shown. This presentation is focused on the Rayonier Mill cleanup site shown here at number 1. This image shows the steps of the cleanup process. We first learn about possible contamination at the initial investigation step when someone calls to report a release, such as a spill or a leaking tank. We then assess the site to determine its priority amongst the other cleanup sites. We have identified over 13,000 contaminated sites in Washington, and over 7,000 of those have been cleaned up. We then study the site and consider cleanup options, often called the remedial investigation and feasibility study phase. We then select a cleanup remedy and document the remedy in a cleanup action plan. Next, there is engineering design of the remedy, and then we construct the remedy and monitor and maintain it. This orange bubble symbol up here represents public input opportunities. The symbol is placed along the process steps to show when there are opportunities for public input. For the Rayonier Mill study area, we are here in the process. In 2019, we took out for public comment the remedial investigation and feasibility study, or volumes 1 through 3. Now we are seeking public input on the cleanup action plan for the study area, what we call the interim action plan. Some of the major steps in the remedial investigation and feasibility study phase include collecting data to determine when contamination is present, where it is, and just how much. We then evaluate the risk from the contamination by determining if there are pathways where humans or wildlife can be exposed. If there is a pathway, then we need to evaluate cleanup. We set cleanup levels for the contaminants and set where the cleanup levels need to be met, what we call the point of compliance. And then we evaluate a range of cleanup alternatives, comparing the benefits, costs, and permanence to select the remedy that is permanent to the maximum extent practicable. That is, a remedy with the highest benefits that is also cost-effective. As we go through the Rayonier Mill study area, I will try to cover what we know about the contamination, pathways of exposure, cleanup levels, and the selected remedy for each media, such as sediment, soil, and groundwater. So let's dive into the Rayonier Mill study area. One of the challenges we have had with the Rayonier Mill site is defining the site boundary. That is where has all of the contamination come to be. The challenge has been in the off-property area from wind-blown pollution and the spread of contamination in the harbor. So Ecology and Rayonier agreed to focus on a study area or a portion of the site as shown here. Our March 2010 agreed order with Rayonier is for this study area. We will be evaluating the off-property contamination separately. This figure shows the study area in relation to the harbor. The overall study area is about 1,400 acres and includes an upland portion and a marine portion. The upland portion includes the 97-acre Rayonier Mill property. The marine portion includes the marine environment off of the mill property and out to where the deep water outfall was located. That is why it is this odd shape. This shows the relationship between the Rayonier Mill and Western Harbor study areas. Both cleanup projects address the entirety of the harbor. Before I launch into the history of the Rayonier Mill, I thought I would clarify the company names, Rayonier, A.M, and Ramp. Rayonier Inc. owned and operated the mill at the time of release of contamination. In 2014, Rayonier Inc. split into two companies. Rayonier Inc., the Forest Resources and Real Estate entity, and Rayonier Advanced Materials, the Performance Fibers entity. This second entity is also known as A.M. In addition, there is Rayonier A.M. Properties LLC, which manages the environmental liabilities. This is known as RAMP. Both RYAM and RAMP have signed the consent decree. When we say Rayonier, and I say it a lot, we are generally referring to RYAM and RAMP. The Rayonier Mill operated for nearly 70 years, from 1930 to 1997. When the mill closed in 1997, Rayonier systematically dismantled the facility and completed several interim actions on the property. The mill property holds great cultural importance to the Lower Elwha Klallam, Jamestown Sklallam, and Port Gamble Sklallam tribes. The photo on the left shows the mill when operating in 1994. Logs were floated into the log pond, then moved across the property in various pulp production processes. The mill produced specialty pulp fibers used in plastics. In this photo, you can see the jetty and the large dock, which is the size of an aircraft carrier. Also, Ennis Creek is here. The photo on the right shows the mill after closure in 2006. Rayonier dismantled the facility and crushed the concrete foundations. One 5 million gallon tank remains, which is now owned by the City of Port Angeles to address the city's combined sewer overflow. This is a schematic of the mill operations. The mill was a pulp mill making pulp from wood chips using an acid sulfite process. The mill had 5 outfalls, which discharged untreated wastewater directly to the harbor until 1972, when Rayonier built the large storage tanks and treatment process for their wastewater. The treated wastewater was then discharged from the deep water outfall. Mill operations caused contamination of the mill property and nearby marine environment. Contamination came from air emissions from a hog fuel boiler, fuel spills, releases from electrical equipment and other mill activities, and discharge of untreated wastewater to the harbor. In the early 2000s, Rayonier conducted several investigations which identified some high-level contamination areas, or hotspots. Rayonier conducted several interim actions. This figure shows the locations of the interim actions. Over 30,000 tons of contaminated soil were removed and taken to appropriate disposal facilities. Most of the contaminated soil was disposed of at the City of Port Angeles sanitary landfill, and petroleum-contaminated soil was taken to a treatment facility in the Tacoma area. This slide shows the tasks required of Rayonier under the 2010 agreed order. Rayonier has completed a remedial investigation for the upland portion of the study area, or Volume 1, a remedial investigation for the marine portion of the study area, or Volume 2, and a feasibility study for the whole study area, or Volume 3. Ecology conducted a public comment period for Volumes 1 through 3 in the fall of 2019. We received about 160 comments and completed a responsiveness summary in early 2021. After making a few revisions, Rayonier finalized Volumes 1 through 3 in 2021. Under the 2010 agreed order, Rayonier was also to complete a first draft of the Interim Action Plan, or Volume 4. While Rayonier submitted a first draft of the Interim Action Plan, it was not to the level that Ecology expected. As the Cleanup Action Plan, or Interim Action Plan, is ultimately an ecology document, Ecology revised the draft we received from Rayonier into Ecology's document describing our selected remedies. This is what we are presenting for your public input. This figure shows sediment sampling locations in the marine portion of the study area. The study area was broken into 4 areas: the log pond, the mill dock, the deep water outfall, and the in-between area. The sampling provides lots of coverage, especially near source areas. Contaminants found in sediment and tissue include heavy metals like arsenic and mercury, polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs, polyaromatic hydrocarbons or PAHs, and dioxins. Sediments also have phthalates and phenols and wood debris. Toxicity testing shows toxic effects to benthic organisms or the small critters that live in the sediment. The higher contamination and toxic effects are near the mill, around the dock, and in the log pond. And I'll show the contamination pattern in a few more slides. This figure shows the soil and groundwater sampling locations in the upland portion of the study area. Red dots are groundwater sampling locations. Blue dots are soil sampling locations. Where there are a lot of blue dots, that's the confirmation sampling in the interim action areas. The red dashed line around the upland is the property boundary and not sampling locations. Contaminants found in soil include heavy metals like arsenic and lead, polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs, polyaromatic hydrocarbons or PAHs, dioxins, and petroleum hydrocarbons. Contaminants found in groundwater include PAHs and ammonia. The presence of ammonia has caused the pH of groundwater in some areas to be very high. The high pH can cause the metals in soil to release and go into groundwater, so we see also metals in the groundwater. Most of the highest soil contamination or hotspots have been removed. Both soil and groundwater contamination is spotty without a clear pattern and kind of all over. We see higher soil concentrations in the West Mill area and higher concentrations in the surface soil rather than at depth. We evaluated the risk from these contaminants and determined that there are complete exposure pathways. Humans and wildlife and plants can come into contact with contaminated soil. Contaminated groundwater can reach the marine environment, potentially impacting the water and the sediments. Contamination in the sediments is bioaccumulating into fish and shellfish, to which humans and other animals can be exposed. And the creosote pilings and timbers are an ongoing source of PAHs to the sediments. And so we selected remedies for each media to address these pathways of exposure. This is a summary of the selected remedies as presented in the draft interim action plan. The costs are those from the Volume 3 report, so are in 2019 dollars. The costs are likely higher today due to inflation. The overall cost is around $30 million. I'm going to go through each of the cleanup media and walk through these selected remedies. Let's start with the sediment media. Sediment is the sands and mud under the water. Again, the main contaminants in sediment include metals, PAHs, PCBs, and dioxins. We set sediment cleanup levels to protect for bioaccumulation from sediment into fish and clam tissue that humans or other animals may eat. We also set sediment cleanup levels to protect the benthic organisms or critters that live in the sediment. The sediment cleanup levels generally need to be met in the top 10 centimeters or 4 inches, and deeper, such as 45 centimeters or 18 inches in areas where we dig clams. This figure shows the concentration of PCBs or polychlorinated biphenyls and dioxins in sediments. We show these as total TEQ, or toxic equivalent. Dioxins and PCBs are chemically and toxically very similar, so we combine them into a TEQ. TEQ stands for toxic equivalent and is a special sum where the concentration of each individual contaminant is adjusted based on how toxic they are, and then they are summed together. The green, yellow, and orange are above the sediment cleanup levels. This figure shows the contamination is close to the mill dock and in the log pond area. This figure shows the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. Again, the green, yellow, and orange are above the sediment cleanup levels. And again, the figure shows contamination is close to the facility, around the mill dock, and in the log pond. The sediments out by the deep water outfall meet cleanup levels for PCBs, dioxins, and PAHs. This figure shows the sediment remediation footprint. The bold red line is the footprint. This captures the PCBs, dioxins, and PAHs. It also captures areas where contaminants show toxicity based on bioassays. We need to take cleanup action within this footprint to reduce exposure to contamination. Beyond the bold red line or footprint, the sediments meet cleanup levels and no action is needed. Earlier this year, Ecology presented the Cleanup Action Plan for the Western Port Angeles Harbor Study Area. I thought I would show a comparison of the two study areas and the two sediment cleanup units. Cleanup actions will take place within these two sediment cleanup units, addressing contamination in the whole of Port Angeles Harbor. It helps to break up a sediment cleanup unit into smaller sediment management areas. These areas may have similar physical, chemical, or biological factors. We have broken the sediment cleanup unit into 4 sediment management areas where different cleanup actions will be used. The darker blue is the Sediment Management Area 1, or SMA 1. It is the area outside and around the dock. SMA 2 in green is the log pond. SMA 3 in yellow is the area under the dock. And SMA 4 in light blue is the nearshore area. You may have noticed that there are portions of the sediment cleanup unit that are not in the sediment management area. The point of compliance for meeting sediment cleanup levels protective for bioaccumulation is measured as an average across the sediment cleanup unit. For example, the average concentration for PAHs across the sediment cleanup unit is above the cleanup level. We need to take action to reduce the average concentrations of PAHs across the sediment cleanup unit so that it is below the cleanup level. Taking action in areas of the highest concentrations should reduce the average concentration across the unit, so we don't need to take action across the whole unit. This slide shows the two types of sediment cleanup methods used in the selected remedy. Dredging involves grabbing and removing contaminated sediment, usually with a large clamshell-type bucket. The sediment is then placed onto a barge and taken to an appropriate disposal facility. Enhanced Monitored Natural Recovery, or EMNR, is placing a thin layer of clean sand on top of the sediment surface. The critters in the sediment then mix the clean material in and effectively dilutes the contamination. EMNR can be done in thin layers and allows the benthic organisms to survive and rapidly recolonize the area. This figure shows the selected remedy for the sediments. For SMA 1, around the dock, the remedy is to fill in the ship berths so there isn't as much of a depression for contaminated sediment to settle in, and to apply EM&R throughout the area. For SMA 2, the log pond, the remedy is to dredge the inner tidal sediments and apply EM&R in the subtidal portion of the log pond. For SMA 3 and SMA 4, under the dock and in the nearshore, the remedy is a contingent remedy. SMA 3 is the area under the dock. The very large dock structure has made it difficult to sample sediments under the dock. We have only 3 data points. And we have limited data in SMA 4, the nearshore area. The dock has over 4,000 creosote pilings, which are an ongoing source of PAHs to the sediments. Ecology is requiring the removal of treated timbers from the dock and the jetty to remove this source of contamination. In addition, the Department of Natural Resources, or DNR, is requiring the removal of the dock and jetty as part of closing the lease agreement, and I will talk a bit more about that in a few slides. So the dock and jetty are to be removed. That is what is shown here with the yellow crosshatching. When the structures are removed, the energy dynamics will change too. The contaminated sediments may move with this change in energy. We need to do better modeling to predict how sediments will move. The selected remedy is contingent on further sediment sampling and modeling. Ecology developed a framework for pre-remedial design data collection and how to use the data to select a sediment remedy for the underdock and nearshore areas. RAMP, the performing party, and Ecology are already working on the modeling approach and sediment sampling plan. The contingent remedies could range from EM&R to thin layer capping to dredging. Now let's go over the soil media. As a reminder, contaminants found in soil include heavy metals like arsenic and lead, PCBs, PAHs, petroleum hydrocarbons, and dioxins. We set soil cleanup levels to protect humans and wildlife and plants that come into direct contact with soil. And we set soil cleanup levels to protect groundwater. That is soil contamination being washed with rainwater into the groundwater. For the Rayonier site, most of the cleanup levels are set to protect humans from direct contact. For protecting humans coming into direct contact with the soil, we look at current and potential future uses. We consider the zoning to help determine the potential future uses. Most of the Rayonier Mill property is zoned for industrial use, as shown here in blue. A portion of the property with the 5 million gallon tank was purchased by the city and will keep being used for industrial purposes. The cleanup in this area will need to meet industrial cleanup levels. The remainder of the property has not been used for industrial purposes for nearly 30 years. We don't know how the property will be used in the future, so we are setting unrestricted land use cleanup levels to be protective for a variety of future uses. Unrestricted means we don't need to restrict the use of the land in those parts of the property that meet the cleanup levels. If during the design of the remedy an industrial use is planned, then we will reevaluate the unrestricted use cleanup levels and consider the industrial use cleanup levels. This figure shows where soil contamination exceeds at least one soil cleanup level, as shown in red. It also shows the property boundary as the red dashed line. The purple crosshatched areas are the interim action areas I showed earlier, and the blue is the city's combined sewer overflow easement. The dashed pink line around Ennis Creek is the potential restoration area. This overall area here in red is about 31 acres. For soil cleanup, we selected alternative SL3 as described in Volume 3. It is a remedy that removes all soil above the unrestricted use cleanup levels and consolidates in the West Mill area under a 2-foot cap of clean soil. In this figure, the light green represents soil above the unrestricted use cleanup levels in the surface soil, and the dark green reflects where deeper soils exceed the cleanup levels. This green area is about 21 acres. The yellow represents where the contaminated soil will be placed and capped with clean soil. This is about 10 acres. The pink dashed line around Ennis Creek is the location of a potential habitat restoration project. All contaminated soil in this area will be removed. In this remedy, we will not require institutional controls, such as use restrictions, over a large portion of the site. There will be controls in the capped area. However, this does not preclude possible future use of the property in the West Mill. Future development will have to be planned with the cap in mind, but the cap can be designed to allow for such development, or the cap can be modified for future development. In addition, I know there are concerns about climate change and sea level rise. RAMP will evaluate the vulnerability of the property to sea level rise and utilize the hydrodynamic modeling to design the shoreline pullback and the capped soil area to avoid sea water inundation. Here is an example of a 2-foot soil cap to prevent direct contact with contaminated soil. We place a geotextile on the contaminated soil, then a clean gravel layer, and then clean soil to support vegetation. This is not a landfill cap. A landfill cap has a low permeable layer, like a plastic liner, to prevent rainwater from washing into the waste. At Rayonier, the soil contamination is low level and does not appear to be migrating to groundwater, so a low permeable cap is not necessary. Remember, the highest soil contamination has already been removed to off-site disposal facilities. The cap will be designed to prevent humans and wildlife from coming into contact with the contaminated soil. We will design the cap carefully to prevent erosion and other disturbances. Groundwater monitoring and inspection remain part of the overall cleanup strategy to ensure long-term effectiveness. I know there has been a strong desire to select alternative SL5, which is full removal of the contaminated soil with off-site disposal. The feasibility study evaluated 5 alternatives for the soil contamination. 2 of the alternatives, SL2 and SL4, included cleanup of only those areas exceeding a remediation level protective of occasional use or trespasser scenario. This is a much smaller footprint. These alternatives relied on institutional controls over a large part of the property. MACA requires that cleanup alternatives should not rely primarily on institutional controls, so ecology dropped these alternatives, which are marked here with a red X. The 3 remaining alternatives are SL5, full removal of contaminated soil above unrestricted use cleanup levels with off-site disposal. SL3, consolidating the contaminated soil into the West Mill area and capping with 2 feet of clean soil. And SL1, capping the contaminated soil in place. All 3 alternatives are protective of human health and the environment. SL5 is the most permanent remedy with a high degree of benefit, and it is the highest cost alternative at $37 million. The next most permanent remedy is SL3. SL3 also has a high degree of benefit but a much lower cost at $10 million. The cost difference between SL5 and SL3 is substantial and disproportionate at $27 million. SL3 is the most cost-effective remedy and considered permanent to the maximum extent practicable. I know there are concerns about capping contaminated soil on a property near the shore. This type of remedy is fairly common as it is protective and cost-effective. Another site where capping dioxin-contaminated soil near the shore is the Port Gamble Bay and Mill site. At this site, nearly 26,000 tons of contaminated soil were removed during interim actions, similar to the Rayonier Mill site. And now they are capping about 6 acres of the property where elevated dioxins remain in the soil. Let's move on to groundwater. As a reminder, contaminants or concerns found in groundwater include PAHs and ammonia. The ammonia has caused the groundwater to have a high pH in areas, which has caused the metals to release from soil and move into groundwater. Since the Rayonier property is next to the marine water, salt water is mixing with the groundwater beneath the site. This makes the groundwater not drinkable. So we set the groundwater cleanup levels to protect the marine water and sediment and not to protect groundwater for drinking water. Ammonia was used as part of the pulp production processes. Ammonia was spilled and released to the groundwater. This figure shows where ammonia is present in groundwater at the yellow and orange spots. The orange is the higher amount of ammonia. This figure shows the pH in groundwater. A little reminder from high school chemistry, pH ranges from 0 to 14. 7 is neutral. The lower the pH, the more acidic the liquid is. The higher the pH, the more basic the liquid is. Drinking water is around neutral, between 6.5 and 8. Rain in the Pacific Northwest is slightly acidic, between 5 and 6. Most of the groundwater at Rayonier ranges between 6 and 8, shown as light pink and light blue. We do have areas where groundwater has a very low pH, shown as a dark pink, and that's near the former acid plant. And areas where groundwater has a very high pH are shown in darker blue. This is where the ammonia is present in groundwater. In the presence of very low pH and very high pH, metals in the soil can release from the soil and move into the groundwater. I just picked nickel as one of the metals we see in groundwater above cleanup levels. Here we see elevated nickel in the yellow and orange areas. Much of the nickel exceedances line up with where we see ammonia and high pH. This figure shows where groundwater has at least one contaminant above cleanup levels. This is all over the place, but there is no clear plume of contamination. For groundwater cleanup, we selected the remedy recommended in the feasibility study. In this alternative, groundwater is treated prior to discharge to the marine environment. Air sparging uses special wells called remediation wells to pump compressed air deep into the ground. The pumped air raises oxygen levels in the groundwater. As the air bubbles rise toward the surface, they help naturally occurring bacteria break down harmful chemicals. The oxygen also helps reduce other contaminants like ammonia, which should neutralize the pH and thus reduce the metals releasing into groundwater. It is impractical to treat the groundwater throughout the property as it is difficult to inject air over such a large area, and the costs are very high. So the air sparging will be applied along the shoreline, treating the groundwater before it discharges to the marine environment. This is alternative G1, which is about $5.7 million. The groundwater will be monitored using ecology-approved network of shoreline monitoring wells. Lastly, let's go over surface water. 5 surface water samples were collected in Ennis Creek. 2 samples were collected upstream and 3 were collected downstream. Metals were detected below cleanup levels, and dioxins were detected slightly above cleanup levels. The dioxin levels were the same both upstream and downstream, which indicates that the site is unlikely to be contributing to contamination in Ennis Creek. So the selected remedies are summarized here. The sediment remedy includes some dredging and EM&R, and the soil remedy includes consolidating contaminated soil that is above unrestricted use cleanup levels and capping with a 2-foot thick soil cap. And the groundwater remedy includes air sparging the groundwater. The overall cost is around $30 million. So now let's go over how cleanup and structure removal and potential restoration tie together. Rayonier, or RAMP, has a lease agreement with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, or DNR. The lease boundary is the yellow line here, and the state-owned lands are north of that yellow line. DNR is requiring RAMP to remove all improvements on state-owned lands in order to close out the lease agreement. RAMP is working with DNR and Ecology to remove the dock and jetty and to reshape the shoreline, make it flatter. These efforts should support any potential restoration work on Ennis Creek by connecting habitat along the shore. The creosote pilings are a source of contamination to the sediments. Ecology is requiring the removal of the treated pilings. We are also requiring RAMP to clean up contaminated sediment at the same time they remove the dock and jetty, and to clean up contaminated soil in the area where the shoreline will be reshaped. The dock is a very large structure, the size of an aircraft carrier. RAMP has already started dismantling the dock. Approximately 800 concrete deck panels have been removed. And the dock has over 4,000 pilings. That's a lot of material to manage. Another environmental liability for RAMP is environmental damages from pollution under the Natural Resource Damage Assessment, or NRDA, program. There is a Port Angeles NRDA Trustee Council made up of NOAA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Ecology, and the Lower Elwha Clallam, Jamestown Sklallam, and Port Gamble Sklallam tribes. For several years now, the trustees and RAMP have been negotiating a potential restoration project for Ennis Creek to address RAMP's NRDA liability. A settlement has not been reached. Soil cleanup in the area of Ennis Creek will meet unrestricted use cleanup levels in order to fully support any potential future restoration of the creek. Let's talk briefly about the consent decree. A consent decree is a legal document that lays out the parties involved, the work to be performed, and the schedule for that work. It also describes the process of payment of costs, how to request schedule extensions, and a process for dispute resolution. A consent decree is different from an agreed order where the parties agree to perform certain actions. Consent decrees are filed in court and the parties agree to be bound by its terms. A consent decree also lays out the terms for legally settling liability. Much of the consent decree is standard, or what we call boilerplate language. There are 29 sections with lots of legal language, and there are 3 exhibits. 2 exhibits are figures, and 1 exhibit is the Interim Action Plan. RYAM and RAMP have signed the consent decree, indicating their commitment to moving forward with the cleanup. If you're going to review the consent decree, I suggest you review the definition section where different terms are defined, and the work to be performed section, which lays out what RYAM and RAMP must do. So to wrap up, we've covered the Interim Action Plan and the consent decree. After the public comment period, we will respond to comments in a responsiveness summary and make any necessary revisions, then finalize these documents. RAMP will move forward with the steps outlined in Section 7 of the Interim Action Plan. Ecology will review and respond to public comments. If updates to the documents are needed, they will be revised. The final documents will be submitted to the Superior Court for approval. Section 7 of the Interim Action Plan is where you will find the next steps and schedule. It's important to note that there is a lot of work that still needs to happen before we start cleanup construction. First, RAMP will complete the hydrodynamic modeling and sediment sampling already underway. Then we can select the most appropriate remedy for under the dock and in the nearshore and use the modeling to help design other cleanup elements. Then RAMP will develop a master plan and schedule recommending the best way to phase the work. Then there is data collection for engineering design, such as refining where soil exceeds the cleanup levels and determining just where to place groundwater wells for air sparging. Next, we enter the design and permitting stage. RAMP will look at all the data and engineering evaluations and prepare the engineering design reports and obtain necessary permits. RAMP and Ecology will consult and coordinate with the tribes on cultural resource protection. These documents will assess risks due to a changing climate and make sure our project is resilient. Then we get to construction. All of the design, permitting, and construction is currently estimated to take 7 to 10 years. Construction work in the water can only occur during certain times of the year in order to protect migrating fish. Demolition of the dock and remediation of the sediments will happen over a few years because of the fish window limitations. After construction, there will be long-term monitoring to make sure we meet and continue to meet cleanup levels.
Thank you for watching this recorded presentation. Links to the online comment submission form and Ecology's Rayonier Mill web pages can be found in the description of this video. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions regarding this public comment period. Thank you again for your interest in this cleanup project.